What happens when Joy Behar decides to challenge Mark Wahlberg live on television, and the conversation slowly turns into an unexpected debate? Before we get into it, make sure to subscribe to Fame After Hours, and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The moment starts like a typical interview on The View. The audience is clapping as Mark Wahlberg walks onto the set. He waves to the crowd, smiles at the hosts, and takes his seat at the table. Joy Behar greets him with a grin. "Mark Wahlberg is here with us today," she says. "Actor, producer, businessman. Honestly, it feels like you're doing everything these days." Mark laughs lightly. "I try to stay busy." Another host jumps in. "You really do. Every year there's another movie or project coming out." Mark nods. "I've always believed in working hard. That's how I was raised." The audience claps politely. For the first few minutes, the conversation stays light. They talk about his new projects, his business ventures, and his famous daily routine. Joy laughs and shakes her head. "Didn't you once say you used to wake up at like 2:30 in the morning?" Mark smiles. "That was my old schedule. It's a little more reasonable now." The audience laughs. But after the laughter fades, Joy leans forward slightly and shifts the tone. "You talk a lot about discipline and hard work," she says. "But sometimes viewers say when celebrities talk about hard work, it can sound a little disconnected from what regular people experience." A few people in the audience murmur. Mark looks at her calmly. "What do you mean?" Joy explains, "There are people watching this show who work long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, trying to take care of their families. So when celebrities talk about waking up early and having discipline, some people feel like it's not really the same kind of struggle." Some audience members clap. Mark nods slowly. "I understand that perspective." Another host adds, "Hollywood life can look very different from everyday life." Mark responds, "That's true, but I didn't grow up in Hollywood. I grew up in Boston in a pretty tough neighborhood." The audience claps again. Joy nods but raises an eyebrow slightly. "Sure, but your life now is very different from the average viewer's life." Mark smiles politely. "Of course it is. I'm very fortunate." Joy continues. "Sometimes when successful people talk about discipline, viewers feel like it ignores how complicated life can be." The audience becomes quieter. Mark responds calmly. "It depends on what advice people are giving." Joy asks, "What do you mean?" Mark smiles slightly. "If someone says waking up early automatically makes you successful, that's obviously not true." The audience laughs. Joy laughs too but quickly adds, "But you've said before that people need more discipline." Mark nods. "Yes, discipline matters." Joy gestures toward the audience. "But some viewers hear that and think it's easy to say when you're a millionaire." A few people clap loudly. The tension at the table becomes noticeable. Mark leans forward slightly but keeps his tone calm. "I see what you're saying." Joy continues, "If someone is working 12 hours a day just to pay rent, hearing a celebrity talk about mindset might sound a little out of touch." Another host tries to balance the discussion. "This is actually an interesting conversation." Mark nods. "It is." Joy looks at him directly. "So let me ask you something." The audience grows quiet. "Do you think success comes more from discipline," she asks, "or from luck?" Mark pauses for a moment before answering. "I think both exist," he says. Joy immediately follows up. "But which one matters more?" Mark smiles slightly, his voice steady. "Discipline keeps you going," he says. "But luck can open doors." Joy leans forward again and asks the question that makes the entire studio go silent. If someone watching today said your success mostly came from being in the right place at the right time, what would you say to them? The audience waits, and Mark pauses before answering. There's a short pause after the question. The audience in the studio is quiet, and you can feel everyone waiting to hear what Mark Wahlberg is going to say. Mark leans back slightly in his chair and smiles, but it's the kind of smile that shows he's thinking carefully about how to respond. "Well," he begins calmly, "I think being in the right place at the right time can help anybody. That's true in almost every career." A few audience members nod. "But," he continues, "you still have to be prepared when that moment shows up." Some people in the audience clap lightly. Joy Behar tilts her head slightly. So you're saying luck might open the door, but discipline keeps it open? Mark nods. Exactly. Another host at the table jumps in. That actually makes sense. Opportunities come and go, but not everyone is ready when they arrive. Joy smiles slightly but doesn't back off the topic. Sure, she says. But there are a lot of people who work incredibly hard their whole lives and never get the kind of opportunity that someone in Hollywood might get. Some audience members clap again. Mark nods slowly. That's true. The honesty of that answer seems to catch people's attention. I'm not sitting here saying the system is perfectly fair, Mark adds. Life isn't perfectly fair for anyone. The audience murmurs in agreement. Joy leans forward again. But don't you think celebrities sometimes oversimplify success when they talk about it publicly? Mark responds calmly. Some might. The audience laughs a little at that. Joy smiles. That was diplomatic. Mark laughs too. I'm just being honest. Another host tries to shift the tone slightly. But Mark, you've talked a lot about your early life in Boston. That wasn't exactly an easy start. Mark nods. No, it wasn't. Joy gestures toward him. And that's part of why people listen to your story. Mark pauses for a second before responding. I appreciate that, he says. But I also try to remind people that everyone's path is different. The audience listens closely. I made a lot of mistakes when I was younger, Mark continues. I had people in my life who gave me second chances. Joy raises an eyebrow. Second chances that not everyone gets. Mark nods. That's true. The conversation is calm, but the tension is still there. Joy crosses her arms slightly and asks another question. So when you hear people say that celebrities sometimes underestimate how difficult life can be for average families, what do you think? Mark answers without hesitation. I think they're right sometimes. The audience reacts with surprised murmurs. Joy looks slightly surprised too. You do? She asks. Mark nods. Look, I'm very aware that my life today is not the same as the life most people are living. Another host nods in agreement. That's a fair point, she says. But Joy isn't finished yet. So then, she says, leaning forward again, when you give advice about discipline and mindset, what do you hope people actually take from it? Mark takes a breath before answering. I hope people take the idea that no matter where you start, you can improve your situation. The audience claps. Joy watches him closely. But you're not saying everyone can become a movie star. Mark laughs. No, he says. Definitely not. The audience laughs too. I'm saying people can build a better life step by step, Mark continues. It might not look like Hollywood success, but progress is still progress. Some audience members clap again. Joy nods slowly. That's a more nuanced answer than people usually hear, she says. Mark smiles. Well, life is complicated. The audience laughs softly. But Joy then adds something that brings the tension right back to the table. Because sometimes, she says, people feel like motivational advice from celebrities can sound a little tone-deaf. The audience murmurs again. Mark looks directly at her. And sometimes, he says calmly, people assume celebrities haven't struggled at all. The audience reacts with a louder murmur now. Joy raises her eyebrows slightly. Are you saying that's unfair? Mark leans forward slightly. I'm saying people shouldn't assume they know someone's whole story. The audience claps. And now the energy at the table shifts again as the conversation begins to get more intense. The audience applause slowly fades, but the tension at the table is still noticeable. Joy Behar looks at Mark Wahlberg for a moment before speaking again. Well, she says with a small smile, that's fair. People don't always know the whole story. Mark nods calmly. Exactly. Another host tries to ease the atmosphere a little. I actually think this is a good conversation to have. Viewers like hearing both sides. The audience claps lightly. But Joy isn't quite ready to move on. She turns back to Mark. Let me ask you something else. When you talk about discipline and mindset, Do you ever worry that people might misunderstand what you're trying to say? Mark tilts his head slightly. In what way? Joy explains, some people might hear that message and think you're saying success is simply a matter of trying harder. A few people in the audience nod. Mark shakes his head gently. No, I don't believe that. The audience gets quiet again. I believe effort matters, Mark continues. But effort alone doesn't guarantee the same outcome for everyone. That answer gets a noticeable reaction from the crowd. Joy raises her eyebrows slightly. That's interesting. Because a lot of motivational talk out there suggests the opposite. Mark smiles. Motivation is useful, but reality is more complicated. The audience laughs softly. Another host jumps in. That's probably the most honest answer we've heard today. Joy smiles a little but leans forward again. But if reality is complicated, she says, do you think celebrities should be more careful when giving life advice? Mark thinks for a moment before answering. I think anyone giving advice should be careful, he says. The audience claps. Joy nods slowly. That's a good point. But then she adds something that immediately brings the tension back. Because sometimes, she says, when very wealthy people talk about discipline, it can sound like they're ignoring the advantages they've had along the way. A few audience members clap loudly. Mark stays calm. I don't ignore that, he says. Joy gestures toward him. So you believe privilege exists? Mark answers without hesitation. Of course it does. The audience murmurs again. Another host nods. That's a pretty direct answer. Mark continues, some people start life with more opportunities. That's just reality. Joy watches him closely. But, Mark adds, that doesn't mean effort stops mattering. The audience claps again. Joy smiles slightly. So you're saying both things can be true? Exactly, Mark replies. For a moment, the conversation feels calmer. Then Joy asks another question that immediately gets the audience's attention. Do you ever feel frustrated when people criticize successful people for talking about hard work? Mark pauses for a moment before answering. Sometimes, he says honestly. Joy tilts her head. Why? Mark leans forward slightly. Because sometimes the conversation becomes very simplified, he says. People either act like success is only luck, or they act like success is only hard work. The audience listens closely. In reality, Mark continues, it's usually a combination of many things. Another host nods. Timing, opportunity, connections, effort. Mark points toward her. Exactly. Joy crosses her arms slightly. But if that's true, she says, shouldn't public figures say that more often instead of repeating simple motivational messages? The audience murmurs again. Mark looks directly at her before answering. I think people hear what they want to hear sometimes, he says. That response immediately gets a louder reaction from the crowd. Joy raises an eyebrow. What do you mean by that? Mark smiles slightly. I mean, if someone already believes success is impossible for them, he says, they might ignore anything that suggests they still have some control over their future. The audience claps loudly. Joy looks surprised for a second. So you're saying mindset still matters? Mark nods. Yes. The room gets quieter again as Joy studies his response. Then she smiles slightly and says something that clearly catches the attention of everyone watching. Well, I have to say, you handled that challenge better than I expected. The audience laughs. Mark laughs too. But the conversation isn't over yet, and what happens next will get an even bigger reaction from the audience. The audience laughter slowly settles down, but the energy in the studio still feels different after the exchange between Joy Behar and Mark Wahlberg. You can tell people were paying very close attention to the conversation. Joy smiles and looks over at Mark again. Well, I'll give you credit, she says. You didn't dodge any of the questions. The audience laughs and claps. Mark shrugs slightly with a small smile. I figured if we're going to have the conversation, we might as well have it honestly. Another host jumps in. And honestly, I think viewers appreciate hearing both sides of this. The audience claps again. Joy nods. That's true. People watching at home probably have strong opinions about this topic. Mark laughs lightly. I'm sure they do. The segment starts wrapping up, but the atmosphere still feels lively. The hosts thank Mark for joining them on The View, and the audience gives another round of applause as the conversation moves toward a commercial break. But the discussion doesn't end there. Not long after the show airs, clips of the moment begin spreading across social media. Viewers start debating the exchange online. Some people say Mark handled the challenge calmly and respectfully. Others say Joy asked important questions that needed to be discussed. On platforms like X, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok, the clip starts gaining attention as viewers share their opinions about the debate. Some comments praise Mark for staying composed. Others say the conversation highlighted how complicated the topic of success really is. One thing is clear, the moment got people talking. And now we want to hear from you. Do you think Mark Wahlberg made a strong point, or do you agree with Joy Behar's challenge? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Fame After Hours for more real talk show stories.